call came in just after midnight. At first, I barely registered it, the crackling of my radio nothing more than background noise as I sipped cold coffee from my dented thermos, my mind dulled by the routine stillness of Yellowstone at night. But then a voice cut through the static, tense and deliberate, and I straightened without realizing it. "Ranger Wilson, we've got a missing person report from Grant Village. Last seen around the West Thumb Geyser Basin at sunset." My exhaustion vanished in an instant as I set my thermos down and reached for my radio. I'd been stationed in Yellowstone for almost a decade, and calls like this never sat right with me. The park was vast, over 2 million acres of wilderness, geothermal anomalies, dense forests, and backcountry trails that could swallow a person whole. The longer someone was missing out there, the slimmer their chances got. Copy that. Who's the missing party? A pause, then, John Walker. Male, 44. Visiting from Michigan. His wife reported him missing about an hour ago. I glanced at my watch. Almost 12:30 a.m. Not good. If he'd gone missing at sunset, we were already 6 hours behind. That was enough time for someone to get hopelessly lost or worse. Any signs of distress? Another pause, slightly longer this time. Not exactly. But the wife said he left the trail acting strange. Kept saying he heard something. That gave me pause. I exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the radio. Yellowstone had its fair share of strange stories, people wandering off, sometimes stripped of logic, other times just lost in the vastness of the park, their awareness dulled by the unnatural quiet. But what stuck with me was that phrase. Heard something. I grabbed my flashlight, my pack, and my radio before heading out into the night, the usual weight of my gear suddenly heavier on my shoulders as I stepped into the truck. The drive from my station at Lake Village to West Thumb took about 20 minutes, the roads empty, only my headlights cutting through the abyss. Yellowstone at night was different from the postcard-perfect landscapes tourists saw during the day. The vast openness, the sheer remoteness of it made the hair on my arms stand up. The forest was nothing but looming shadows on either side of the road, and the occasional flash of movement in the trees reminded me how little I could actually see past that fragile beam of light. I pulled up to the small ranger station near the West Thumb entrance, where 2 other rangers were waiting, Jim, a seasoned vet with graying hair, and Torres, younger, newer to Yellowstone, but sharp when it counted. Jim greeted me with a curt nod. "Walker's wife is at the lodge. She's shaken up. Says they were walking near Abyss Pool when he just went off trail." The words sank into my gut, that familiar sense of unease creeping in. "Alone?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Torres shook his head. "Yeah. She said she tried to stop him, but he kept saying, 'Just a minute, I need to check something.' Then he walked into the trees. Never came back." I considered that for a moment, my mind running through the usual scenarios. People got distracted all the time, stopping for a better view, venturing just a little too far off the boardwalk. But something about this felt different. "Why didn't she call sooner?" I asked. Torres sighed, shifting uncomfortably. She said she thought he'd come back. Figured he just needed to clear his head. Then when it got dark, she panicked. He hesitated, then added, "We've had people get lost out there before. But there's something about this one." Jim looked uneasy, and that made me uneasy. Jim had seen it all. He wasn't the type to get rattled. I waited for him to finish the thought. She said she heard something too. After he left. Like someone else was out there with him. I frowned. Like another person? Jim shook his head, his voice quieter now. She said it didn't sound human. Torres let out a nervous laugh, like he didn't want to be the one to take this too seriously. Could have been a coyote or something. But we all knew better. I adjusted my pack and grabbed my radio. "Let's start near Abyss Pool. If he's still out there, he won't last the night." We reached the boardwalk at West Thumb just after 1 a.m., the geothermal basin eerily silent, steam rising from the boiling pools like specters in the dark. The smell of sulfur hung heavy in the air, clinging to everything. My flashlight swept across the empty wooden path, illuminating the bubbling pools and warning signs scattered along the way. Danger, scalding water. Do not leave trail. It wasn't uncommon for tourists to ignore the signs, thinking the rules didn't apply to them, but those people usually weren't from around here. Walker was from Michigan. He should have known better. Torres rubbed his arms, glancing around. Man, this place gives me the creeps at night. Jim ignored him, scanning the tree line. If Walker went this way, his wife said he stepped off right near Abyss Pool. I aimed my light at the tree line beyond the boardwalk. The forest was pitch black, impenetrable, like a wall of void. My gut tightened. I turned on my radio. Walker? This is Ranger Wilson. If you can hear me, call out. Silence. We stepped off the boardwalk, our boots crunching against the damp soil. 100 yards in, the darkness thickened. The deeper we went, the more the air seemed to press against us. Then we found the first sign of him. His flashlight. It was lying on the ground, still on. The beam was pointed upward, illuminating the towering trees above us. Like he dropped it mid-stride. I crouched down, my fingers brushing the cold metal. Walker? If you're out here, we need to, and then I heard it. A faint whistling. Not the wind. Not an animal. It was deliberate. Melodic. But off. Torres stiffened. You hear that? Jim's hand went to his gun. Yeah. The whistling came again. Closer this time. But there was no one there. And that's when I saw it. A set of bare footprints in the dirt. Fresh. Leading away from the flashlight. They weren't heading deeper into the woods. They were coming back out. But there was no sign of Walker. And the tracks just stopped. Like he'd been lifted right off the ground. The sight of those footprints sent a deep, instinctual unease crawling up my spine. They were bare, distinct in the loose soil, and yet they led in the wrong direction. If Walker had been out here, barefoot, why would he be coming back toward the trail but never reach it? I glanced at Jim and Torres, both of whom had fallen silent, their flashlights hovering over the impossible tracks. The night had grown even quieter, the usual ambient noises of the forest, the rustle of small animals, the distant call of an owl, now completely absent. It was like something had pressed pause on the world around us. I forced myself to think logically. All right, I muttered, my breath visible in the cold air, let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe he ditched his boots for some reason. Maybe he got turned around. But my own words felt flimsy, a half-hearted attempt at rationalizing something that didn't make sense. No one voluntarily goes barefoot in Yellowstone, not with the sharp rocks, fallen branches, and hidden thermal pockets that could boil the flesh off your bones. Jim knelt down and ran a gloved hand over the edge of the footprints, his eyes narrowing. There's no drag, he said after a moment. If he was lost, stumbling around, we'd see uneven steps. These are clean. Like he was walking with a purpose. I didn't like that either. Torres shifted uncomfortably, gripping the strap of his radio like a lifeline. So what the hell are we saying? He walked out here barefoot, and then, what? Just vanished? His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the undercurrent of fear beneath it. None of us had an answer, and the longer we stood there, the more that damn whistling gnawed at my nerves. It wasn't constant, every minute or so, it would drift through the trees, soft and slow, always the same pattern of notes. If it had been an animal, a bird maybe, it would have varied. But this was deliberate. Calculated. Jim exhaled through his nose and stood up, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking off a bad feeling. We keep going. We follow the tracks as far as they take us. He looked at me, waiting for agreement. I hesitated, every instinct in my body telling me that something was very wrong here. But Walker was still out there. If we started making excuses, letting our nerves get the better of us, we were no better than the tourists who panicked and got themselves killed. I gave a sharp nod, flicking my radio back on. Dispatch, we're proceeding deeper into the tree line, tracking footprints approximately 100 yards from Abyss Pool. No visual on the missing party yet. Static crackled back at me, but no response. I tried again. Still nothing. I exchanged a glance with Jim, who lifted his own radio to his lips. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Amaze. Do you copy?" The silence stretched, thick and unnatural. Yellowstone's radios weren't perfect, especially out in the backcountry, but this close to the main station, we shouldn't have been getting interference. Torres muttered something under his breath before taking a step forward, breaking the stillness. "Screw it. Let's just find him and get the hell out of here." He started along the trail of footprints, his flashlight bouncing off the trees. Jim followed a moment later, leaving me no choice but to go after them. The deeper we moved, the worse that silence became, like we had stepped into a bubble where nothing else existed. The footprints continued in a straight line, unwavering, until we reached a small clearing where they simply stopped. No scuffs in the dirt, no sign of struggle, no broken branches to indicate where he might have gone next. Just an abrupt end, as if Walker had been plucked right off the ground. I felt a cold sweat prick at the back of my neck. "This doesn't make sense," I said, more to myself than anyone else. Torres swept his flashlight in a slow arc, the beam catching on the dense foliage surrounding us. Maybe he doubled back? Stepped in his own tracks? Jim shook his head, his jaw tight. "Then we'd see overlap." "There isn't any." I turned in a slow circle, my stomach twisting. There was nowhere to go. The ground was firm, no signs of a sinkhole or sudden drop-off, and there hadn't been a single sound to suggest an animal attack. It was like he had just ceased to exist. And then the whistling started again. This time, it was right behind me. I spun, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The trees stood motionless, their branches barely stirring in the faint wind. My pulse pounded against my ribs. That had been close, too close. Jim cursed under his breath, his own light scanning the shadows. "That's not an echo," he muttered. "That's something moving." Torres had gone rigid, his fingers flexing around his flashlight. "I don't like this, man." His voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "I don't like this at all." Something about the air had changed. The cold was sharper now, heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm. My own breathing sounded too loud in my ears. We needed to go. Now. "We're heading back," I said, keeping my voice steady. We marked the last known location and call in a proper search at first light. Jim didn't argue, but Torres was already moving, practically speed-walking back toward the direction we'd come. I kept my flashlight up, sweeping the trees every few steps, every nerve in my body screaming that we weren't alone. The whistling continued, weaving through the trees, always just out of reach, like someone was circling us. Then Torres froze. "What the hell is that?" His flashlight locked onto something ahead of us, just off the trail. At first, my brain refused to register what I was looking at. A figure stood in the trees, half hidden by the shadows. Tall. Too tall. The proportions were wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. But the worst part was the way it stood there, completely motionless, as if it had been waiting for us to see it. The second my light hit it, the whistling stopped. Jim swore and reached for his gun, but before he could draw it, the figure moved. It didn't step forward. It didn't walk. It just shifted. One moment it was 10 feet back, and then suddenly, impossibly, it was closer. My body locked up, my mind scrambling for logic, for reason, for anything that could explain what I was seeing. Then the radio on my belt crackled, loud and garbled, distorting as a voice pushed through the static. It was one word, stretched and warped beyond recognition, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. Run. The moment that voice crackled through my radio, stretched and warbled like something was chewing at the edges of the transmission, my body acted before my brain could catch up. I grabbed Torres by the collar and yanked him backward, my flashlight beam flickering as I turned on my heel. Jim was already moving, his instincts sharp enough to know when something was beyond reason. We didn't argue, didn't waste breath on questions. Whatever was in those trees, it wasn't something we could reason with. We ran. Branches snapped underfoot, the uneven ground threatening to trip us at every step, but fear kept us upright. The forest blurred around us, a mess of blackened trunks and shifting shadows. My pulse hammered against my skull as the cold pressed in from all sides, that unnatural chill that didn't belong in the already freezing Yellowstone night. I didn't dare look back, not with that thing moving the way it did, not with the way it had just appeared without a sound, without a reason. It hadn't just been standing there. It had been waiting. Torres cursed, stumbling but catching himself, his breathing ragged and uneven. What the hell was that? His voice was barely audible over the pounding in my ears. Jim didn't answer. None of us had answers. We just kept running. The boardwalk had to be close. Had to be. I focused on that thought, clinging to it, forcing my legs to move faster. Then, just when I was certain we were clear, when I could almost see the glint of the railings through the trees, the whistling started again. This time, it came from everywhere. Not just behind us, but ahead. To the sides. In the trees, in the damn ground. High and low, overlapping, a sound that should have been harmless, almost cheerful, but had twisted into something wrong. It was close, too close. I forced myself forward, my fingers gripping my radio so hard I thought the plastic might crack. Dispatch, come in. This is Ranger Wilson, 3 Rangers in need of immediate assistance at West Thumb. Do you copy? Static. Then, layered underneath it, barely audible, whispering. I felt my chest seize, my body rejecting every instinct that told me to listen, but the words were right there, threading through the white noise like fingertips dragging through water. I couldn't make them out, couldn't tell if they were English, couldn't tell if they were even human, but I knew they were meant for me. Then the radio screamed. Not a voice. Not words. Just a shrill, ear-splitting burst of distortion, loud enough that I dropped it. It hit the ground with a dull thud, the speaker still blaring that impossible sound, rattling against the dirt. The others barely reacted, too focused on getting the hell out of there, but my mind caught onto one single, terrifying realization. It wasn't just a noise. It was mimicking us. I had heard that exact same scream before, Torres, earlier, when he'd first seen the footprints. His exact pitch, exact panic, copied and regurgitated back at us. And then the trees moved. I felt it before I saw it, something shifting in the periphery, something big. The ground felt like it trembled, not from an impact, but from the sheer wrongness of whatever was out there. Jim yanked my arm, pulling me forward, and I nearly lost my footing as we barreled onto the boardwalk, our boots slamming against the wooden planks. The sudden openness should have brought relief, but all it did was make me feel exposed. We didn't stop. Not until we were nearly back to the trucks, our breaths ragged, hands shaking. I turned, my flashlight still pointed at the trees. They were still. Normal. Silent. No movement. No impossible shapes. Just the vast blackness of the forest stretching endlessly into the night. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur from the nearby hot springs, but beneath it, something else lingered, something rotting. Jim swore, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. Torres was bent over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. None of us spoke for a long moment, the cold seeping back into my skin, making me realize just how much I was shaking. Finally, Jim broke the silence, his voice hoarse. We're calling this in. I nodded, swallowing down the bile in my throat. Yeah, we are. Torres looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. And what the hell are we gonna tell them? I didn't have an answer. Because John Walker was still missing. And whatever had taken him, whatever had been out there with us, was still in those woods. Watching. Waiting. And whistling. By the time we made it back to the trucks, my hands were still shaking. I tried to steady them as I reached for the radio again, but I could still hear that damn whistling in my head, looping over and over like it had wormed its way into my skull. I forced myself to take a breath, steady my voice. Dispatch, this is Ranger Wilson. We have a missing person, last seen near Abyss Pool. 3 Rangers on site. We need a full search team mobilized at first light. The static hissed back at me, too long, too unnatural, and I braced myself for that whispering again, for that horrible sound that had no business coming from my radio. But this time, a voice crackled through, clear but strained. "This is dispatch. Copy, Ranger Wilson. Do you need immediate evac?" Jim was leaning against his truck, arms crossed, his face drawn tight like he was trying to keep himself from thinking too hard about what had just happened. Torres was pacing in short, agitated steps, rubbing his arms like he couldn't get warm. I gritted my teeth, choosing my words carefully. "Negative on evac. No injuries. But we have unexplained activity in the search area. Recommend additional personnel." Another pause. Then dispatch came back, sounding wary. "Unexplained activity?" I hesitated, trying to think of a way to explain it that wouldn't make us sound like we'd lost our minds. Unusual sounds. Unaccounted footprints. Possible presence in the woods. I didn't want to say whistling. I didn't want to say something was out there with us. I could already hear how it would sound to the supervisors, how easily it would be dismissed. Another pause. "Understood, Ranger Wilson. Search team will be deployed at first light. Return to station and file a full report." I clicked off the radio and exhaled slowly, feeling my pulse still hammering in my throat. Jim pushed off his truck and looked at me. "What the hell are we supposed to put in this report?" His voice was low, unreadable. Torres let out a short, bitter laugh. "That we chased after a guy, found his footprints going back to the trail, then got stalked by something that doesn't make sense? Yeah, that'll go over well." I didn't answer. I just got into my truck, gripping the wheel tight, and started the engine. The drive back to the station was silent. Normally, after a late night call, we'd be talking, processing, complaining about dumb tourists, but none of us said a word. The headlights carved through the darkness, but it felt thinner now, like the night wasn't as deep as it had been in the woods. It was a stupid thought, but it stuck with me. When we pulled into the lot, the station was quiet, the overhead lights casting pale yellow halos onto the pavement. Inside, the air was warm and stale, the scent of old coffee lingering in the corners. Jim went straight to his desk and dropped into his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. Torres hesitated before moving to the sink, filling a paper cup with water and downing it in one go. I sat down at my desk, staring at the blank report in front of me. The cursor blinked. How the hell was I supposed to put this into words? I started with the basics. Time of call. Location. Subject missing. But when I got to the details, when I had to explain what had actually happened, I found myself pausing, fingers hovering over the keyboard. My mind kept going back to that moment in the woods. The way the footprints just stopped. The way the trees moved. The way my radio had spoken in a voice that wasn't mine. I swallowed hard and started typing again, keeping it clinical. Unidentified auditory phenomenon. Footprints inconsistent with subject's known footwear. Possible natural explanations pending daylight investigation. Lies. Or maybe just easier versions of the truth. Jim leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "We've all seen weird shit out here before," he muttered, like he was trying to convince himself. "Tourists swear they see ghosts, hear voices, all that. High altitude, dehydration, paranoia, it messes with people. Hell, I've had cases where guys walked off trails and swore something was calling them into the woods." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "But this is different." Torres shook his head, arms crossed tight. "I've done night shifts in bad parts of the country, man. I've been in places where I knew I was being watched. That wasn't the same." His voice dropped lower. "That wasn't human." Silence settled between us. None of us wanted to be the first to say it. Something else had been in those woods. Something had been waiting. And John Walker was still missing. At first light, the search team arrived. They were professionals, experienced rangers, volunteers, even a couple of dogs brought in from Jackson. I briefed them the best I could without sounding insane, focusing on Walker's last known location, the footprints, the direction we believed he had been heading. Jim stood nearby, arms folded, listening but not adding anything. Torres avoided looking at the woods entirely. We set out just after sunrise, the cold crisp but less suffocating now. The forest looked different in the daylight, smaller, more manageable. The branches that had seemed endless and hungry in the dark now looked normal, just trees. The footprints were still there, just as we'd left them, leading back toward the trail before stopping in the clearing. But in the daylight, something new stood out. A second set of prints. They hadn't been there last night. They were farther apart, deeper, like someone, or something, had been walking back toward the tree line. And they weren't barefoot. They matched the size and shape of John Walker's boots. But he was nowhere to be seen. Jim crouched, running a hand over the edge of one of the prints, his jaw tight. These weren't here before. His voice was quiet, controlled. Torres muttered something under his breath, stepping back. So what? He just came back and left again? No one answered. I reached for my radio, my fingers cold despite the morning sun. We weren't looking for a missing person anymore. We were looking for something else entirely. Something that had left the woods after we had. Something that had come back. The morning air had lost its bite, but I still felt that cold settle in my gut, deeper than the temperature could explain. The new set of footprints, Walker's boots, unmistakable, led back into the forest from the clearing, heading in the direction of the main trail. If they had been here last night, we would have seen them. There was no mistaking that. And yet, here they were, as fresh as if they had been made just before sunrise. One of the search dogs, a black lab named Duke, sniffed along the edges of the prints, his handler watching closely. The dog was alert but confused, nose twitching, moving back and forth over the tracks without committing to a direction. Jim stood next to me, arms crossed, watching the dog. That makes sense to you? He muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. No, I admitted. Dogs weren't perfect, but they were reliable. If Walker had walked out of the woods, Duke should have picked up on something, where he had gone, how long ago. But the way the dog hesitated, stepping back every few moments like something was throwing him off, sent an uneasy ripple through my gut. One of the volunteers, a local guide named Harris, adjusted his pack and spoke up. If these prints are new, then he's gotta be close. Maybe he got turned around, doubled back, but he could still be out here. His voice carried that practiced optimism that came with experience, keeping the team motivated, reminding everyone that people do get found alive. But Jim and I exchanged a look. Walker had been missing since yesterday. If he had walked back out after we left, why hadn't he gone straight to the lodge? Why hadn't he called for help? And more importantly, why hadn't we seen him leave? I forced the thought aside and focused on the search. All right, I said, adjusting the strap of my pack. We follow these prints. If he's out here, we'll find him. The team spread out, staying within sight of each other, radios checked, markers placed to keep track of the route. The footprints led away from the clearing, past the place where we had first found his flashlight, through the trees, back toward the trail. For a few minutes, I let myself believe that maybe this was normal. Maybe he had come back, found his bearings, and walked out. Maybe he was sitting in the lodge right now, embarrassed but alive. But then we reached the end of the tracks. And they stopped. Again. Dead in the middle of the path. No turning, no staggering, no sign of distress. Just gone. Harris swore under his breath, staring at the ground. The hell? He crouched, running a hand over the dirt, the way Jim had done last night. The prints were crisp, clear. These don't just end, he said, voice low, like he was trying to convince himself. Where the hell did he go? Torres stood back, staring into the trees, rubbing his arms again. You're gonna tell me that looks normal? His voice was tight. Because it doesn't. That isn't normal. The search team shifted, uneasy. Duke's handler gave the dog a soft command, sending him forward, but Duke whined, stepping back again, tail low. Something was wrong. Jim let out a slow breath, running a hand through his graying hair. He turned to me. "We need to widen the search." I nodded, pressing the radio to my lips. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Wilson. We've followed a second set of tracks belonging to the missing subject. They stop at the main trail. No sign of further movement. Advise on next steps." The response was immediate. "Copy, Ranger Wilson." "Stand by." A pause, then, "We just received a report from Grant Village. Walker's wife says he came back to the lodge at dawn." Silence. I stared at the radio, the words not registering at first. "Repeat that?" "Walker returned to the lodge, unharmed. Came in just before 6. Says he got lost, found his way back this morning. The team was watching me now, waiting." I turned, looking at the fresh boot prints leading straight to where we stood, the empty space where they ended. Then I looked past them, into the woods, where I knew we had been watched. Where I knew something had been walking. I didn't know what was worse, the idea that we had chased something else through the trees last night, or the idea that whatever it was had left those prints after Walker was already safe at the lodge. Jim exhaled sharply and muttered, "That doesn't make a damn bit of sense." Torres swallowed. "Yeah, well, none of this does." I pressed the radio again, my voice level. "Understood. We're heading back." The debriefing at the lodge was short. Walker was fine, exhausted, dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. He told us he had gotten lost, wandered deeper than he expected, and spent the night moving in circles before finally finding the main road at dawn. He remembered feeling off, like something was keeping him from thinking straight, but he blamed it on stress, the altitude, maybe a bad reaction to something he ate. His wife was relieved, hugging him tight, brushing off questions as long as he was safe. We didn't mention the footprints. We didn't mention the whistling. We didn't mention that we had spent half the night tracking something that wasn't him. Instead, we filed the report, marking it as a successful recovery, and went through the motions like it was any other case. But that night, as I sat in my cabin, the quiet pressing against the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had brought something back with us. That whatever had been out there, whatever had been walking in Walker's footprints, wasn't done yet. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. A single, distant whistle. And this time, it was right outside my window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The whistle had been soft, barely audible over the wind shifting through the trees outside my cabin, but I knew what I had heard. My mind tried to rationalize it, to push away the creeping horror threading through my chest. Maybe it was just a bird. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. That sound didn't belong. It was the same whistle from last night, the same one we had followed into the woods, the same one that had looped through the trees when we had realized Walker was gone. I reached for my flashlight with slow, careful movements, my pulse thudding against my ribs. My cabin was dark except for the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds, casting thin slats of pale white onto the wooden floor. I debated whether to turn on the light, whether I even wanted to see what might be out there. But then the whistle came again. Closer. My breath hitched. The sound wasn't coming from the forest anymore. It was coming from my porch. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, forcing my body to move. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to pretend I hadn't heard it, but I had spent too many years in the park to ignore my gut. Something wasn't right. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my boots scraping softly against the floor as I stood. My gun was still in the locked cabinet by the door, too far away. I regretted that now. The floor creaked under my weight as I took a step toward the window. Slowly, carefully, I reached out and pulled down one of the blinds just enough to peek through. And I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the porch light, half hidden by the shadows, still. Not moving. Not shifting. Just standing there. The porch light wasn't strong enough to illuminate its features, but I could see its outline, tall, thin, wrong. My breath caught in my throat. The way it stood was unnatural, like it wasn't quite sure how to hold itself, its arms hanging a little too low, its shoulders hunched just slightly too much. And then it did something that made my stomach flip. It took a single, careful step forward. Not hurried. Not aggressive. Just slow. Deliberate. And then it whistled. A perfect, hollow note that sent ice crawling up my spine. I backed away from the window, my skin crawling with something primal, something I hadn't felt since I was a kid lost in the woods at dusk, feeling eyes on me but not knowing where they were. My body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. If I moved too fast, if I made a sound, I knew it would react. I didn't want to find out how. I reached for my radio on the bedside table with trembling fingers, keeping my eyes locked on the door. "Dispatch," I whispered, barely above a breath. "This is Wilson. I need a unit at my cabin immediately. Possible intruder." Silence. Then a soft click of static. A voice came through, garbled, too distorted to understand. I tried again. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Another burst of static. And then, a whisper. Not from the radio. From right outside my door. I froze. My stomach clenched. It was low, almost playful, just beneath the sound of the wind. I couldn't make out words, couldn't tell if it was even speaking English, but I could feel what it meant. It was waiting. It was testing me. I took a slow step back, toward the gun cabinet. My fingers fumbled with the key, struggling to keep steady. Another creak sounded from the porch, another step. I turned the key. The lock clicked open. And then something knocked on the door. Soft. 3 taps. Gentle. Like it was asking permission to come inside. I felt my stomach drop into my feet. I stood there, gripping the handle of the gun, the weight of it grounding me. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel the sweat prickling at the back of my neck. My mouth was dry. My body locked up. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence shifted. I didn't see it move. I didn't hear footsteps. But I felt it. One moment, it was right at my door, and the next, it was by the window. My head snapped toward the blinds, and I knew it was looking at me. I couldn't see its face, but it could see mine. And then, just before my body could register the urge to run, to shoot, to do something, the whistle came one last time. And the porch light flickered out. Darkness swallowed the cabin, leaving me standing in the middle of the room, heart hammering, gun shaking in my grip. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And slowly, the whistling faded into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the door, my gun resting in my lap, the blinds shut tight, the radio clutched in my other hand. No more knocks. No more whistles. But I didn't feel alone. Not really. When morning came, I forced myself outside, my body heavy with exhaustion, my mind still replaying every second of what had happened. The porch was empty. The footprints from last night had been swept away by the wind. But something was off. Something felt different. I walked to the edge of my cabin, scanning the tree line. And that's when I saw it. Something had been carved into the wood just beside my door. 3 parallel marks, deep and deliberate, running the length of the frame. Not like an animal. Not like a knife. Like fingers. Fingers that had been waiting for me to open the door. I stood there, staring at the 3 long scratches in the wood beside my door, my breath slow and deliberate, forcing myself to process what I was looking at. They were deep, unnatural, too precise to be the result of an animal, but too raw to be man-made. Something had marked my cabin. Something had been waiting. I traced a gloved finger along the grooves, feeling the jagged edges where the wood had splintered. I knew what this meant. It wasn't just an encounter, it was a message. It had been right there, waiting for me to open the door. If I had hesitated just a little longer, if I had made a single mistake, I wasn't sure I'd still be standing here. A shiver ran down my spine as I turned back toward the woods. The morning sun had done nothing to shake off the lingering weight of last night. The trees stood motionless, the wind barely stirring their branches. Yellowstone was awake, birds called in the distance, the crunch of undergrowth signaled the movement of small animals, but it felt hollow. Like the space between the trees had grown wider, stretched into something unnatural. I needed to report this. I grabbed my radio and pressed the call button. "Dispatch, this is Wilson. I need an incident report filed at my cabin. Possible break-in attempt." The words felt ridiculous even as I said them. I already knew how this would go. No one had seen anything. No cameras in the area. Just another strange thing in the park. A few seconds passed before a voice crackled back. "Copy that, Wilson. Sending a maze your way. You alright?" I hesitated. I should have said no. Should have told them I hadn't slept, that something had been out here whistling at my door, that I had spent the last few hours gripping my gun like it was the only thing keeping me alive. But I didn't. Instead, I exhaled slowly and said, "Yeah. Just tired." The lie sat heavy on my tongue. Jim showed up an hour later, his truck rolling up the dirt road with a familiar crunch of tires against gravel. He stepped out, his face lined with exhaustion, his eyes flicking to the scratches the moment he saw them. He didn't say anything at first. Just ran a hand over the marks, his fingers lingering at the edges like he was testing if they were real. "Jesus," he muttered. "You sure it was a person?" I shook my head. Didn't see them. Just heard the whistle. His eyes snapped to mine. "The whistle." I nodded. "Same as last night." Came right up to the porch. Jim let out a slow breath, stepping back. He looked at the ground, scanning the area like he was expecting to see something else. "No prints?" "None." He frowned, chewing the inside of his cheek. "No way in hell a person gets this close without leaving tracks." I didn't respond. He already knew that. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of the situation sat between us, unspoken but undeniable. Finally, Jim shook his head and pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is a maze. Cabin perimeter checked. No immediate threat. Logging to report." There was another pause before dispatch responded, the same careful tone as before. "Copy, a maze. Anything else?" Jim looked at me. I looked at the scratches. "No," he said finally. "That's all." I didn't go inside right away. Even after Jim left, even after the sun rose higher and the shadows stretched thin, I stood outside my cabin, staring at the woods. Something had come here last night. Something had left something behind. I couldn't ignore the feeling curling in my gut. This wasn't over. Something was coming back. I didn't sleep the next night. I left the lights on in my cabin, my gun loaded on the table beside me, the radio clutched in my hand like a lifeline. Every so often, I'd get up and check the window, peering into the dark, waiting for movement. But nothing came. The forest was still, the wind barely strong enough to stir the trees. It should have reassured me. It didn't. The silence had weight, pressing against the walls of the cabin, filling the space between the floorboards, settling into my chest like something unseen was watching. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to leave. I needed to move, to do something before the paranoia ate me alive. Jim had already started his patrol up near the Lake Butte overlook, and Torres was covering the west side of the park, so I took the loop road back toward West Thumb. Back toward where it had started. The geyser basin looked different in daylight, but I still felt that weight in my chest as I stepped onto the boardwalk. The pools churned, steam rolling off the surface, distorting the view. The tourists hadn't arrived yet, and the stillness felt unnatural, the usual sounds of early morning birds strangely absent. I walked slowly, my boots echoing against the wooden planks. Every few feet, I scanned the tree line, waiting for something to move. And then I saw them. More footprints. My breath hitched. They were fresh, leading away from the boardwalk into the trees, bare, just like the ones we had found when Walker went missing. But these weren't alone. There was another set, trailing beside them. Larger, heavier. Spaced too far apart to belong to something human. I crouched, reaching out, fingers hovering just above the indentations in the dirt. They were deep, unnaturally precise. The longer I stared, the more I realized something was wrong. The second set of prints were walking beside the first. They were following. The realization sent a slow, crawling sensation up my spine. My fingers twitched toward my radio, but I didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, I followed them, moving carefully, deliberately, my breath steady even as my pulse quickened. The prints wove between the trees, away from the boardwalk, deeper into the woods. I hesitated. I shouldn't be out here alone. I knew that. But some part of me needed to see. Needed to know. The prints continued for another 20 yards before stopping in a small clearing. Just like last time. They ended. No sign of struggle. No branches snapped. Nothing disturbed. Like whoever, or whatever, had been walking had just disappeared. I exhaled slowly, scanning the trees. The shadows stretched long, dark pockets nestled between the trunks, unmoving. The air felt heavier here, thick with something I couldn't name. I reached for my radio. "Dispatch, this is Wilson." My voice was steady, but my throat felt tight. "I need a ranger unit at West Thumb. Found more footprints leading off trail. No sign of missing parties." A pause. Then, the crackle of static. But no response. I tried again. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Silence. I swallowed hard, my fingers flexing around the radio. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. The whistle came from behind me. Soft. Slow. Too close. I turned fast, gun in hand, my heart hammering against my ribs. My flashlight beam cut through the trees, illuminating empty space. Nothing. But I knew. I knew it was there. Watching. Waiting. I took a step back, my pulse thundering in my ears. The air felt suffocating, like the trees had closed in, like the space between them wasn't space at all but something else, something waiting to swallow me whole. I forced myself to move, to turn, to walk back toward the boardwalk without running, without showing fear. The whistle came again, fainter this time, drifting through the trees. By the time I reached the truck, the sun was fully up. The forest looked normal again. But I knew better. Something had followed me out. And it wasn't done yet. I didn't go back to my cabin. Not after what had happened at West Thumb, not with the footprints and the whistling and the way the trees had seemed to breathe around me. Instead, I drove, unsure at first where I was going, only knowing I needed to put distance between myself and that place. My knuckles were white around the steering wheel, the radio still silent at my hip. The roads were empty in the early morning, the tourists not yet flooding in, and for once, I welcomed the loneliness. But as the miles passed, a tightness grew in my chest, a slow, crawling pressure that I couldn't ignore. I knew the feeling. It wasn't over. The same way I had felt it in the woods last night, the same way I had known something had been outside my cabin, I felt it now. I was running, but I didn't know if I was running away or towards something worse. I pulled over near Sylvan Pass, letting the engine idle for a moment before I cut it entirely. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks dusted with the last traces of snow, the air sharp and thin in my lungs. Resting my hands on the wheel, I tried to steady my breathing, tried to shake off the feeling crawling up my spine. I needed to call it in, file the report, go through the motions like this was just another incident, but my radio was dead. No static, no distortion, just nothing. I clicked the button again, adjusting the frequency, but the silence remained. The hairs on the back of my neck rose as I stared at the device, my fingers hovering over the dial before I finally shoved it back onto my belt. The silence wasn't normal, and I wasn't about to pretend otherwise. Something was coming. Stepping out of the truck, I scanned the tree line, my boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of the road. Everything around me looked too still, the kind of stillness that didn't belong, as if the world was waiting for something to break it. I had patrolled these roads 1,000 times, walked these trails, spent entire seasons watching over the park, but this morning, Yellowstone felt different. It felt like something had changed, like I had crossed an invisible threshold I hadn't noticed until it was too late. A whistle echoed from the trees. Faint, deliberate, calling. My heartbeat spiked, but I didn't move, only turning my head toward the sound, pulse thudding in my ears. At the tree line, half hidden in the shadows of the towering pines, something was standing there. The sunlight cut across its form, not enough to reveal details, just enough to give shape. Tall. Motionless. Watching. The longer I looked, the worse it became. The limbs were too long, the shoulders hunched at an unnatural angle, the head tilted slightly to the side as if observing me. A sharp, terrible certainty settled in my gut. It had been waiting. I forced myself to breathe, to hold my ground, to keep my hands still even as my instincts screamed at me to run. The figure took a step forward, the movement fluid but wrong, as if it had learned how to walk but hadn't quite perfected it. The whistle came again, but this time it came from behind me. My stomach twisted as I spun, my hand already reaching for my gun, my mind scrambling to process what was happening, but the road was empty. The silence stretched too thin, pressing in from all sides. When I turned back to the tree line, the figure was gone. A sharp chill ran down my spine, my breath coming too fast, the pressure in my skull mounting. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was something worse. This was a message. I wasn't meant to leave. I wasn't meant to walk away. The realization crawled under my skin, sinking deep into my bones. It had followed me from the woods, from the missing person case, from the footprints that shouldn't have existed. It had marked my cabin, had come to my door in the dark, had stood outside my window and waited. And now, it was closer. My body locked up, torn between fight and flight, every nerve screaming at me to move, to leave, to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever was standing just beyond my reach. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Not anymore. Taking a slow, careful step backward, I eased toward the truck, my boots scuffing against the gravel. The space around me felt wrong, stretched too thin, like the world itself was bending. I forced myself to open the door, climb inside, and grip the steering wheel with hands that weren't quite steady. As I turned the key in the ignition, the whistle came one last time, drifting through the trees, soft and patient, like it knew I'd be back. I filed my report later that day. I did everything by the book, wrote it up, kept it clean, left out the parts that wouldn't make sense on paper. The missing person case was closed. Walker had come back, alive, unharmed, confused but safe. That's all anyone cared about. No one asked about the footprints in the woods. No one asked about the silence on my radio. No one asked about the thing that had been watching me from the trees. I should have left Yellowstone, put in for a transfer, packed my things and driven until the park was nothing but a fading memory in my rearview mirror. But I didn't. Because something in me knew this wasn't over. I knew that whatever had been out there, whatever had been waiting, was still watching. It was still out there, still moving through the trees, still standing just at the edge of the light where I couldn't quite see it. Waiting. And one day, when the sun went down and the tourists went home and the woods swallowed the night whole, I would hear it again. It would whistle. And this time, I wasn't sure I'd be able to walk away.